Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much for tuning in for 90 Day Word with Kachael, where we are reading through the entire Bible in 90 days. We just completed day 34, where we read 2nd Chronicles chapter 36 through Ezra chapter 10. And today I just wanted to do a very short reflection on something that really stood out to me while reading in the book of Ezra, the 9th chapter. Now, if you just to give a quick recap, so the children of Israel have been carried away. They are being held captive and living as servants and slaves in different countries. And there has been a push or call to allow some of what they call the remnant of Israel to go back to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple of God, the one that Solomon built, to rebuild it because it was destroyed by the Babylonians when the Babylonians came in to the area and took away captive the Israelites. So they have rebuilt the temple, and now Ezra is taking the people back, and they are going to give sacrifices and things of that nature at the temple. Now, God told them that Ezra is a scribe and a priest. And I believe it says I think it's chapter 7, that Ezra had given himself unto study of the word and of the laws and statutes, and that his desire and purpose was to study and to teach it to other believers. Now, they have gone into the land, and we know that the land is surrounded by many other groups of people who worship many different gods. And it was commanded them that they should not take of any of the daughters of the people of the lands around them to marry. But we find out that they did in Ezra 9. So they were told not to marry any woman who wasn't an Israelite, basically. But they did, and not just one or two, many of them did it. And so Ezra, they come and they tell the word to Ezra and tell Ezra, hey, these people, the men have married all these women that they shouldn't have married, and they have children by them. So the part that really stood out to me is that when Ezra hears this thing, it says he rent his garment and his mantle, and he plucked off the hair of his head and of his beard, and he sat down astonished. He sat down astonished. He rent his clothes, he plucked out his hair and his beard, and he just sat astonished. And then in verse 4, that was verse 3. In verse 4 it says, he sat down astonished until the evening sacrifice. So this wasn't a short time that he was astonished, but this was a long time. This sin, the action of his people so hurt him, so astonished him, so frustrated him, so consumed him with whatever feelings he was consumed with, that he couldn't move. He sat down and he was astonished. He was shocked until evening. But then it says in verse 5 that at evening sacrifice, he rose up from his heaviness and he fell on his knees, and he spread out his hands unto the Lord. And he said, I am ashamed and blush to lift up my face to thee. This really touched me because there are many times where we do things in life where we hear of things that are done by people that we are astonished. He didn't even participate in this sin, but these are his people who have participated in this. He didn't sin, but those around him sinned. His people sinned. And it astonished and shocked him to the point that he couldn't move until the evening. But when he moved, even in his heaviness, even in his hurt, even in his pain, even in his frustration, even in his being ashamed, he fell on his knees and prayed to God. And I think that we as believers need to embrace this right here. That even in our heaviness, even when we do things that we know we shouldn't do, even when God has told us over and over and time again not to do something, but yet we still fall into that. Even in our greatest sin, even in our greatest weariness or heaviness or hurt or pain, though we might be astonished for a time, the next move should be to pray. And not just for ourselves, because a lot of times we get bogged down in our own mess. Oh, I did this and I'm ashamed and it hurts. But when we hear of other things that people have done, not to talk about it, not to talk about them, not to, figure out what other people have to say, but in that time, when we hear of something so astonishing that someone else has done, when we hear that children are killing parents, when we hear that parents are killing children, when we hear that siblings are killing each other, when we hear of shootings in our schools, when we hear of lying and deceit that is reigning and prevailing in our places of leadership, when we hear of abortions, when we hear of divorce, when we hear of rape and molestation and sexual abuse, when we hear of depression, when we hear of suicide, when we hear of things that we know is not God's desire for his people, when heaviness comes, our next action should be to pray, to fall on our face and say, Lord, forgive us for not trusting in you. Forgive us for doing things that we know we shouldn't do. Forgive us for being engrossed and being wrapped up in the culture around us and not heeding your word or your wisdom. Because even when we sin, even when we fall short, it doesn't change who God is, because even in our worst place, God is still a provider. And Ezra mentions that in his prayers. He says, even when we were bondmen, even when we were in chains and captive, you were there. And you are seeing us out. You are giving us the opportunity to come into you. And this really stood out to me because I can't say you, but I've spoken with people many times who have done something that they just feel that they cannot be forgiven for. They have had a relationship with God, that they have done things and they were walking right with the Lord, and then they do something and they feel that whatever it is that they did just completely and forever separated them from God. And to the point that they don't even want to pray about it or seek God's face. That's how ashamed they are. And Ezra is showing us here that even in our astonishment at what we are capable of doing, because sometimes the word says, take heed lest you fall. So you think that some things might be beyond you, but the next thing you know, because you're not taking heed of yourself or that which is around you, you get wrapped up in what's going on, what everyone else is doing, even though you didn't mean to, even though that was not your plan and purpose. But because you weren't being watchful and minding that which is going on around you, you get caught up in it too. And that's why God had told them to stay away from the groups of people around you, because it will creep into you little by little to the point where you don't realize that you're even doing it. And you're doing what everyone else is doing. Because that's what happened here. It's not one or two people who took wives of the communities around them. It's a lot of them. So no doubt someone did it and they were like, oh, well, nothing happened to them. Or, well, that marriage seems to be working out good, even though God told us not to. Oh, someone else is doing it. Oh, someone else is doing it. And next thing you know, everyone or most of the men in the community have now gone against God's commandment. But even in doing something, I think that was a tangent. But even in doing something that we know we shouldn't, that astonishes us and makes us ashamed to even talk to God about it, we need to follow after Ezra and get on our knees and pray. Even in our hurt, even in our astonishment, even in our shame, our first act should be to turn to God and to pray and to repent of what it is we've done. And so I hope that resonated with you, and I hope that you will remember in your life that no matter what happens and no matter how shame or guilt might try to keep you bound and keep you from turning to God, that it is in those moments when we are most ashamed of our actions, of our words, of our thoughts, that's when we should turn to God and to fall on our knees and to seek His grace and His mercy and His love. Because He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And He is a God that even in our worst times, He is at His best. So I love you all, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.